Well, welcome to the last session of the day. I'm Jeanette Maister from WCN, the sponsor of the mini studio. We're going to talk today about how to gather data and how to use it. And just some quick background on me. I know I said I'm from WCN, but I actually am, like most of you guys, I spent many years in campus recruiting. I was most recently the global CEO of campus recruiting at Credit Suisse. And before that, I was at Lehman Brothers for many years in campus roles, regional and global campus roles before they were no longer. So I come to you today not as an ATS, CRM for campus and whatnot, but really as one of you to talk about my past experience and hear about your views on data. So I'm also really a data geek. I'm a big data geek. I love data. I always had to collect it globally and report on it and put together presentations to board of directors and whatnot. And so one thing that I've found over the years in my roles on campus is data is great if you have it and you've collected it in a systematic way. But there's times where you don't have the data. And so what I wanted to sort of have this discussion today on what are we all collecting? What are we not collecting? How can we improve? What are some really interesting pieces of data that maybe some of us are using and some are not? And so my hope is we can sort of, we have the microphone and our panelists here today, but if we could sort of share some of those best practices. So to sort of kick off, one thing I'm going to share with you, and I'd love to get some views on it, is one thing I always collected was not just where I lost candidates to, but where my declines were going. And at the time it was Goldman Sachs, because Goldman was sort of my arch enemy, and now they're my client, which is sort of funny because now they're my friends. But I also would always collect who I was winning from. So I would always keep track of when my interns came in, who, did they have an offer also from Goldman? Did I actually win against Goldman for once? Did they have an offer from JP or whatever it was? And so I started to get into the methodology where someone could come to me and say, hey, today we maybe had 3 losses to JP Morgan, and that was horrible, and everyone's sort of freaking out, and I could take a step back and say, you know what? Last year we actually had a win rate against JP Morgan at 30%. So 30% of the time I gave an offer to Pan Am campus, I would win against JP Morgan. I'm making up these numbers, by the way, 30% of the time. And so, that day a banker approached me and said, 3 people declined, and I sort of looked at the current data that I had, and I said, we're still at that same win rate. So, yeah, that's terrible. We need to get our, alumni from JP onto these, candidates and really try and, change that win rate and increase it, but it's not like the sky is falling. And I think a lot of times in campus recruiting, where the sky is falling, we have these sort of interactions and things happen, and we sort of freak out before looking at the data. So I give you that as one example. So I thought we would just sort of kick it off, and maybe we could come up with some things that we're using as an example of that. Doesn't have to be as earth-shattering. Maybe that's not earth-shattering to you. Maybe it is, but we can sort of go down and whatever. So we have friends from Enterprise.
Okay, Dylan Schweitzer, Enterprise Holdings. I've been at Enterprise for 19 years. 19, yes. I track a lot of things in the recruitment process, so I'm tracking applicant to first interview to second to third to hire. I can break it down by which hiring manager, if we have particular issues with one hiring manager, if we're seeing a big fail rate. We can track it by gender and by race. We can track it by source. So we look at a whole lot of things. I mean, some of that is because of OFCCP compliance, but we track a whole slew of things, and we can track throughout the entire process what's going on. We track offer to hire ratio. We certainly have a lot of stories about which companies we're losing people to. I don't know if we don't have percentages of a specific company, so that's interesting. So that might be new. Probably our biggest challenge with tracking. I mean, I've turned all of our tracking into practically an automated tracking where it's all coming from true sources, where it used to be a lot of self-reported data, and it was just wrong. And so we're doing such a better job today. The one area that I do not have the ability yet to track automated is internet cold calling. When our recruiters are headhunting candidates based on they find a resume online somewhere, or they find a candidate through LinkedIn, and they make a phone call and they speak to that person, I want to track, and right now it's just self-reported, how many times did you have to call? How many, did you leave a message? That tells me whether this recruiter's leaving an effective message versus that one. 20% of the time the person calls back, 10% of the time they call back this recruiter. Tells me, oh, we've got a voicemail problem. Then when they speak to them, how many people does it take for you to speak to a candidate before you bring them in for an interview? This is all manually tracked today, and I don't know how to get past that. But that's one of the things for me. That's my new data challenge that I'm dealing with.
Where are you tracked? You said it's automated. Where is it all?
So we've got our ATS, so we use ISIMS for our ATS, so that's where our applicants, first, second, and third hires are coming from. We use PeopleSoft for our internal hiring, so that's where I'm getting our hiring from. So a lot of it comes from ISIMS, some of it comes from PeopleSoft. Those are probably the two main data sources that I'm using. And then we've got, from a cost perspective, I track, of course, cost per hire, cost per source, cost for everything. And so when we track that, I'm getting a lot of that from our accountants. They're filling out a spreadsheet for us, which is manual, but it's really not because it's accounting. It's perfect. It's perfect, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
On iSIMS, do candidates put in where they came from, or does that track their path for how they got to your website? Because I always find that people are like, oh yeah, we were on your website. I was looking at your job. I'm like, no, you weren't. Like, you were somewhere else. I want to figure out where you were. What do you do to combat that issue?
It's a big problem. We just talked about sourcing, but we've got the digital track of what they clicked to see. So we've got a digital track ID on where they came from if it was an internet source. We've got their self-reported, this is my source. And then we have the recruiter conversation tracking the source. That's what, and then when they come in for new hire paperwork, they fill out a paperwork that tells us their source. So the recruiter that identifies their source, that source must match what they come in for new hire paperwork. If those two don't match, regardless of what happened throughout, then we've got to have a conversation before they get entered into the system. Once they get entered into the system, that's the source that I'm tracking for hire.
Yeah, great point. It requires a lot of due diligence. And to get there. My name is Ben Gotkin, principal consultant with Recruiting Toolbox, former recruiting leader at Marriott, McGladrey. I was also at the MITRE Corporation, where I did a lot with metrics too, tracking a lot of the same things. As it relates specifically to college, though, when I was at McGladrey, the last 2 years, I was overseeing college strategy there, and the primary things that I was looking for in terms of college metrics, I was looking for school performance, so particularly the funnels from the school, how many applicants, how many interviews, how many hires, looking at intern conversion rates. Actually, prior to that, looking with our early identification programs, how many of those were turning into interns, how many of those were turning into new hires. And it was interesting, the last session we were talking about source of hire. When it comes to source for me for college, the source was the university. What I was also interested in is and we were talking about, Jeanette and I were talking about this earlier, and we were both tracking this, is influence. What were the influencing factors? We were doing a lot in social media back then, actually, a tremendous amount in social media. I want to know what was effective. What were people actually looking at? What were they seeing? What were they finding to be useful? How much were the professors how much were campus events influencing? So we actually had a very extensive campus survey, of which we typically would get a 55 to 60% response rate off of from our new hires that would give us a lot of interesting directional information, and then track that over time. Look for the trends. Look for, year over year, are we doing better on certain campuses? Are certain divisions are more effective than others? If divisions are lagging year over year, why is that happening? For me, metrics and data, typically helps me bring up as many questions as answers. And those are the types of things that I'm typically looking for.
Wow, that was a really tough act to follow. I don't know that there's really much that I can add. My name is Miriam Campbell. I am the Campus Recruiting and Development Manager over at ICAP. I've been there a few months, but I've been in the campus recruiting space for quite some time. Again, not really much I can add to that, but I would say one thing that I do track that I really feel is meaningful to us is the retention rate of the graduates that we're hiring. So we go through this extensive process of trying to get the best candidates and recruit them, and we wine them and we dine them and we sell them the dreams. But what happens after they actually join our programs? Are they happy? Are they staying? Are they feeling like they got what we sold them? Because it really forces us to go back and reevaluate what our programs are, what we're doing, how we're meant to engage the candidates, see if we're actually following through on that. Because I think one of the things that has come up quite a few times at this conference so far is that the people that we really want to take back on campus are the recent graduates. The people who have just joined the firm, they're the most excited. If we can't keep that excitement alive in our new graduates, how can we expect them to be effective recruiters? When underclassmen reach out to them and say, well, what was your experience like at ICAP? I want them to say they had a terrific experience, because if they say no, then all of a sudden my pipeline at that university is dead. So really just going back and doing our due diligence and making sure our programs are delivering, that they're getting exactly what they're looking for, so that when we want to grow our program, expand our brand, we have a strong foundation to do so.
I'm really curious, because I think that's great measure long term. But can you say, for example, how many people you hired 5 years ago are still with you? Can you tell me what percentage of your directors came from the college program? I mean, what is the measure you express?
No, I'm working out today.
So actually, I could tell you, I've actually just recently joined ICAP, so I've actually run some metrics myself just to see what that looks like. And I can honestly say that I'm not excited about where that number is right now. I think it's something we definitely have to improve on. But I think it's really about staying engaged. It's not just about hiring and letting them go, especially for this generation where we want to make sure that we're developing them, because that's what they're looking for. So really staying engaged with those who come through the graduate program way after they're off program. So once they're into their full-time permanent role, have we just kind of left them floating in the wind? Are we still engaging? And by continuing to engage with them, we get to continue to hear about what's happening, how they're feeling. Are they still continuing to get that development? Because I think for a lot of graduate programs, they get a lot when they first start. They get to meet CEOs, they get to meet board members, they get to meet everyone under the sun. And as soon as they're off program, they feel like, regular John Smith, and then that's it. All the great stuff stops. So at that point, they're looking to move on. So instead of just having that happen, we want to make sure we continue to develop them and give them what they need. And I've also been personally involved in the exit interviews, and my colleagues globally have done the same. And really, we'll sit down one-on-one when a graduate decides to leave and figure out what exactly went wrong. Is it that you feel like you've outgrown the role? Do you feel like you didn't get what you needed here? Did you want more training? What exactly were we not providing that made you want to leave? I mean, sometimes they just may want a brand new experience. We don't know unless we ask. And it really helps us keep our program fresh and make sure that we're doing exactly what we set out to do.
Yes, please do. Yeah, Dan, whatever you want.
Come on. So I think it's fascinating. Now, we have a global people survey that we do at EY to measure job satisfaction. Would you recommend, blah, blah, blah. The issue that I find, I'm just curious on your take, is that so much of that has zero to do with the recruiting process. And so you, as the head of recruiting, is that your role, head of recruiting? Campus, head of campus recruiting, and a role that I had for many years, there's only so much that you can influence their experience after they got here. So when you get that data and you find that people leaving because it's not what they thought, or they weren't happy, or their manager was a jerk, is probably a big reason that you might not hear. What then do you do? Do you translate that into changes to your recruiting process, or do you then get on a pedestal and talk about making changes to the organization?
I guess it really depends on what the issue is. If it's something that doesn't sit necessarily with me, and again, I'm also development manager, so a lot of that does sit with me. But if it's an issue with they felt like they weren't getting continuing learning and development, then I'm going to reach out to the L&D team and raise that and say, okay, now we've got them aboard. They've gone through this extensive training, and then it was crickets. What can we do next? What's our plan for these people? We can't just hire them and say, okay, we're going to bring you into the organization and that's it. We need to think about where exactly do we expect your career to go? What are our hopes for you, so that way we can make sure that we're continuing to keep you on that track. So if it's something that's within my remit, then I'm happy to address it. If not, then I need to bring in my colleagues, because it's not a one-man ship. And I'm happy to engage anyone however I can.
To what you just said, and to what other folks here, what do you think about the concept of re-recruiting every 6 months And for the college venue, at what point do you hand off the re-recruiting from the college team to the experienced hire team?
Who wants to take that? Great question.
Well, if you're speaking to re-recruiting when they still work, they haven't left, correct? Yeah, correct. So in our company, it's typically 120 days that the recruiter is involved in the onboarding of that candidate. So they're still sort of providing a mentoring relationship with that new hire. They're going out to the new hire lunch with the vice president, and there's still some interaction. They'll place 30-day calls, 60, 90-day calls into the candidate to see that they're still engaged. Is it everything that I told you it would be? You know, what have you experienced? What challenges are you experiencing? So walking them through that, and then it's almost like an account executive, account manager role. The recruiter's the account executive, they're the hunter, and the account manager is our HR generalist. And so we sort of transition that relationship over where the generalist now owns that employee for the rest of their career. The recruiter's not entirely dialed out of it, but they're way out of it compared to the way they were in that first 120 days.
Well, certainly with campus, you know, the college, you know, as soon as you're starting to work somebody, they come in as the extern, they come in as the intern. It is constant. You're constantly recruiting them because as soon as they go back to campus, then they have the opportunity to then be recruited by the other firms or the other companies, the other competition. So, you know, regardless of whether you're intern or not. So that is absolutely critical through that stage. In my experience, I've always wanted my recruiters to have at least a 30-day follow-up at the bare minimum. That call is happening. If it's a campus recruiter then, and I mean, I think it's a wonderful idea to pass along. Is it really the recruiter's responsibility, or is it just somebody in HR's responsibility, or even the hiring manager or the manager's responsibility to do the re-recruiting though? At some point, you know, the recruiter does kind of have to let things go. But I think that the manager, it should absolutely be part of their responsibilities to constantly re-recruit their own people, especially if they're in high demand.
That concept of re-recruiting is fairly adaptive. No, you can address it. You can address that.
Just repeat the question then.
No, I didn't have a question. You just, but you were saying, yeah.
Here we go.
The concept of re-recruiting is anathema to most every company that you and I know about. You know, it's not called that. It's called development and somehow retention. And it's spelled differently too. Okay, it has the same number of letters, but it's spelled differently. And the concept and the end result is different. Merely a statement.
Would you like a rebuttal?
I'd just like to say I agree that retention and re-recruiting are not the same thing. To that point, yes, but that should absolutely be any manager's job. Part of their job description is you continuously re-recruit your own people. But you're right. No, most of them feel their employees are privileged to work for them. That's right.
You can speak to it. I was just going to say, how do you coach the hiring managers? So the question was, how do you coach the hiring managers on that?
Well, I guess I'll take this. I think it's something that you kind of have to think about holistically even before the start of the recruiting process, because what I found a lot, particularly in financial services recruiting, is that everyone wants to hire in their own image. And that's great. However, you know, now we have a class of 150 people and they all look alike, they all dress alike, they all speak alike, they all think the same way. And there's no way a company's going to grow with having that. So initially, really having managers understand what it is that we're looking for, you know, what's the company line and how are we trying to get there. And by helping them understand that first, it's a little easier to coach them into the re-recruitment process. Because as other panelists mentioned, we are constantly recruiting. You know, we have freshman, sophomore programs. They've gone through this program. Now they've got our name on their resume and now everyone else wants them. How do we get them back for their junior year summer? You know, once they've come for the junior year, they get the offer for full-time. How do we get them back? So it's really about having them understand that it's not a one-time thing, it's not a one-time engagement, that we have to keep kind of going back to the well, letting them know that we're engaged. It's not necessarily about a job, but make it feel like it's personalized. and that it's not that we just need a body in the seat. We want you to be in the seat. We need you to be in the seat.
And that's a big challenge sometimes with certain schools, because there are schools out there, career services departments out there that believe that internships are, one should do maybe multiple internships at multiple different companies, or that just because they did an internship there doesn't mean that they necessarily should go on and convert to a full-time hire. But you know what? If somebody was an intern for me and they did a great job with an intern for me, I don't agree with that at all. I absolutely want to convert that person. And so I know, not answer your question, but to say, I think that sometimes we have this kind of tug, these misaligned motivations between what employers ultimately want out of re-recruiting their interns and what the career service is seeing as being in the best interest.
Absolutely.
That goes towards, and you can answer, that goes towards having some sort of service level agreement in place.
So you're saying it goes to having some sort of service level agreement in place. Right.
Again, a college recruiting service
Right.
level agreement is different than an experienced hire
Oh, sure.
service level agreement.
Sure. Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
So I'm going to change the subject a little bit, if the group doesn't mind. Think about data. One piece of data that I've always found over the years at times is difficult, particularly in campus, to calculate cost per hire. Cost per hire, because if you think about the internship that we're talking about, you spend whatever money on a university, bring in your interns. Some of them you'll get full-time offers to, some you won't, some will accept. Maybe you go back in to dip your toe in and get a few last kids at that college campus. And so there's a few ways, and it goes over sometimes 2 years before that person starts full-time. And accounting always over the years is sort of, and I don't know if this happens with you, for campus sort of breaks their head saying, no, Jeanette, you just need to look at 1 year and just give us the cost per hire. And so there's a lot of different ways to sort of cut the numbers, because in the end it's really cutting the numbers. So I'm curious to talk either those in the panel or those in the room. When you think about campus recruiting and cost per hire, how do you calculate it, just thinking about intern and full-time, or do you just sort of take that straight shot? I'm just sort of curious about that.
Well, I can give some perspective for a lot of different clients. So I'm Steven Rothberg. I'm one of the owners of the job board collegerecruiter.com. We're one of the co-hosts of this, or organizers. We have clients that don't calculate cost per hire at all. I would say at any given time, we're probably working with about 300 different organizations. I would say at least 75% of them have absolutely no clue where their candidates, where their applicants are coming from, and therefore it's impossible for them to calculate a cost per hire. At best, the other 25%, most of those are doing it in such a fundamentally flawed manner that they would be better off not doing it, because the results are horribly inaccurate. And just as my favorite story is years ago, new recruiting manager, I'm talking to him on the phone. It's, basically the standard sales call. This is why you should use College Recruiter, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, I got to tell you an interesting story. I just started here 6 weeks ago. First thing I did is I came in and I had a meeting with our recruiters. It's like, I want to find out where our applicants, where our hires are coming from. So come back to me with a report. I want to see by source how many people. So came back, number one source by far, Monster. Totally made sense. It sounded fine. It's like, okay, now I want to find out what the cost per hire was. Come back, report. Well, Monster, they had a zero cost per hire because they had never used Monster. And yet the drop down on their applicant tracking system had Monster as one of the sources. And Monster's brand, especially at the time, it still is a strong brand, but back in the Super Bowl ad era, it was an even stronger brand. So candidates, A, they don't know where they come from. B, they don't really give a rip where they come from. So they go through the drop down. And I see with a lot of our clients, the number one source by default on their ATS is our own career center. So the employer's website is listed, and that's the default. Well, guess who put that there? It's the applicant tracking system company, and it totally cooks the numbers. So you look at the ATS, and it's like, our website kicks ass. And it's like, it doesn't. It's that your candidates don't give a rip about giving you accurate data. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm on the career site, so I'm going to put that down. So we have a small number of clients that actually, enterprise being one of them, care about it. and are using real data in real ways. And as Dylan and I were talking earlier, no one knows with any real degree of certainty where all of their candidates are coming from. It's a lot better than nothing. But we have some clients that will only look at the last source. Did they click through from a banner? Did they click through from a job posting? Did they get hired through an on-campus interview, whatever? But last source is, I don't think, is usually the most important source. And that, I think, is where we should really be trying to go at.
You know, it's an interesting question. I like to poll my students to find out exactly perhaps why they might be choosing the actual website as the source. If I had to guess, it would probably be because they want to present themselves as having being interested in that particular company. In other words, we always talk to them about career fairs. When you walk up to each company, make sure they know, I'm interested in you not because you have a job, but because I'm interested in you for a very compelling reason. So presumptively, and I guess you could probably track if they're not telling the truth as well. I don't know if anyone tracks that back. If they came from somewhere else, I don't know if anyone's doing that to that level. Yeah, you do. But the point is, generally, they want to show that they have interest in the company. They're not just following a job opening, but they want to have particular interest in a particular job from a particular company.
Great. All the way in the back.
I think a better question to ask on the website is not where did you hear about the job, but maybe what factors led to you completing the application. So, you know, did you have the strength of a referral from a friend? Did you see our social media? Did you see us in the news? You know, what factors led to your decision? And that will allow you to provide more content in those areas as opposed to just saying, okay, well, our website is great, so let's just focus on that. You know, probably not, but you could add it as a checkbox, you know.
WCN keeps track of everything.
Jeanette, do you know of an applicant?
I do, but I'm not here to. I'm not here to sell anything. But if you remember the marinara commercial, I'm dating myself from years ago. Prego, you know, Prego marinara, it's in there. Prego, it's in there. So most people, when they ask me, "Does your ATS do that?" The answer is Prego. Back over.
Just a quick question, because your question wasn't source. Your question was cost.
Correct.
So.
Correct.
But it's intertwined. There's no question that if you have lousy data, you're not going to be able to cut it very, very far. On the other hand, the financial data does exist, and fundamentally there are some basic approaches that people have come to agree on in the last few years. And about a year and a half ago, in February, I believe, the first human resource standard was published as part of the American National Standard Institute, and it was cost per hire. And that document, if you will, is available and can help companies build a standard approach to how they calculate cost per hire. That doesn't mean they should just use it, but if they wanted to compare what they're doing at Ernst & Young to what they're doing at Deloitte, you are in a position where you can back out what's unique to Ernst & Young, and you now have this standard that can be compared to Deloitte, who's doing the same kind of thing. And I will tell you that companies like ADP and others are now building reports that comply with that standard on a global basis. And I expect part of that standard to be changed and to be at a global level within the next year to 2 years. So there is some. It's the American National Standard Institute, ANSI. You can also search the SHRM website, and you'll find it there. And if you fail in those two things, then you can send me an email, and I'll send you my copy. But my point is, cost. This is an argument that's been going on for a long, long time. Yeah. And at the basis of this is cost is only a measure of efficiency if what you're doing is quality. So I think your point for raising this was, if you don't know what the quality of what you're doing is there, then all you're learning is that you're more efficiently doing bad things. And you really want to first feel good that what you're doing is high quality, and then try to increase the efficiency of how you do it. And that's a critical comment, I think, for everybody who's getting into metrics, in that it's easy to bend to your bosses and leadership who's saying you got to cut another 10%, because they are telling you that. You got to cut another 10%. You got to cut another 10%. And the reality is you need to first make sure that you're cutting the right things. And so you got to focus in on measuring quality, and that's what this panel is here.
Absolutely. And actually, it's great because we're at the last end, so I'd love to hear a little bit about how people track quality. But
Yeah,
you
no,
can
that's great.
answer whatever
That's great.
first.
Okay, couple things that Jerry said that I just have to like jump in to build on, not to contradict, but because you don't contradict Jerry. Just kidding. The standards for calculating cost per hire, great, awesome. What I also see is a lot of companies, when they're doing campus recruiting, they calculate it in incredibly different ways. We have a really large, very sophisticated client that takes all of their travel costs from all of their recruiters, hotels, airlines, meals, everything, and they take all of their campus hires from across the country and they say, okay, last year we recruited 347 people, so our total cost for all the travel and all that kind of stuff, we divide that by 347, and we say if we hired 10% from that campus gets 10% of our travel costs, even if it was located right across the street from their head office. And by, you know, and also if they're a New York company and they go up to Alaska to recruit, then they're subsidized. They're just not using the data properly. The quality issue leads me to another thing, and that is when we're talking with clients and they say, you know, should we do this kind of an ad campaign or that kind of an ad campaign, or how do we compare to some other client, it begs the question of what the goal was. We have clients that do email campaigns with us or banner ad campaigns with us, not because they're expecting to be able to track anybody that applied or were hired, but because it builds their brand. So there's support. And that, depending upon the client, is really important. If they want to let diverse candidates know that we are interested in hiring diverse candidates, you might not see that in your statistics. But you can measure that by going to campus and saying, what was our awareness last year amongst that diverse student body versus this year? And was it because of that email with this company, or that banner ad, or that party we hosted, or the student association we subsidized, or whatever? Who knows? But at least you're getting closer.
I have to completely agree. It's not really about cost per hire for us. I'm going to say for most campus teams, it's about building the brand, because a lot of the money that's spent up front, I may not see a return on that for another 4 or 5 years after I've spent time at that university, after I've hired people from that university, after they've gone back to the university and sung our praises. So it really is a bit difficult to look at it in those terms for us. It's not a static thing. It's not, I mean, you might get an annual budget, but it's not something you can look at, you know, on a yearly basis. It's something that you have to think of a long-term goal and strategy, and hope that the things that you're doing are going to yield you the results that you want in a few years.
I'm going to stick on cost if you don't
Go for
mind.
it. Let's do it.
I'm bringing it up because Jerry brought it up. I've never been a fan personally of benchmarking externally, particularly cost. To me, I don't really see the point, but if I certainly want to do it year over year myself, and I probably want to be able to slice it and dice it a lot of ways. And actually, I think one of the simplest calculations that I find out there, and what I find to be most useful as it relates to source, is cost per source. So if I'm making X investment, and of course you got to have good source data too. And so, like with enterprise, I've done my best in my previous roles to auto tag as much as possible. So for example, Career Builder. We had in the past, I had huge accounts with Career Builder, big spend. We auto-tagged everything that came through Career Builder, so we had a pretty solid idea. Somebody applied, they didn't even select a source; it was all selected for them, and we could slice and dice it down to level and part of the organization. And one thing we absolutely realized out of that is we were posting all of our jobs to Career Builder, and we gave all of our recruiters licenses. Half the recruiters weren't using the licenses, and we were making hardly any hires at all at the manager level or above through Career Builder. So we just stopped doing it. We stopped. We cut our postings in half. We cut our licenses in half. And we cut that spend, and we ended up spending that money on LinkedIn instead, where we felt that, particularly for manager level and above, we were going to get that. So, and then we started measuring that and the ROI from that. So, for me, to be able to correlate costs directly to the source and then study that with an ROI year over year, that to me is really where I want to get at. That to me is much more important than what my competitors are spending.
And did you share that data with CareerBuilder?
When we told them we were cutting our contract in half, yes, we did.
Great.
The only thing I have to add in regards to source, because I agree with all of that, for us, I think that in addition to having all this tracking, the recruiter themselves, telling stories about what they got from a university, what they got from a particular source, is almost as important as the physical dollar. And so, you can track down the dollar, how much did I spend on that, but you can get bad measurements. And a lot of times the recruiters say, you don't understand, I spent $300 on this campus at a pizza party, and I got 4 hires from that because I got an hour with these students of just personal one-on-one time. And you're going to cut my budget by 10%, but I can't cut that $300. And so there's got to be someone behind the scenes. If you've got a really good recruiter, that goes so much further than a report. The reports are important, but you've got to have the right people behind it that are giving you this information.
Yeah. And to build on that, I think sometimes, the numbers, the context of the numbers that are put out there, particularly around cost, particularly around cost per source, people look at it as one number is higher than another, and we need to reduce our costs, and we need to reduce the higher number. The problem I always had with even just producing one general cost per hire for a company is the initial reaction is you got to cut your costs. Okay, well, what impact is that going to have on my quality and my speed? Okay, and you know what? The sources that I'm spending the most with are producing the best candidates. Okay, and you know what? Even if I got to spend $20,000 with an agency to make a hire that's going to produce $1 million in revenue, isn't that worth it for me to do that, as opposed to not, completely ruling out agencies and trying to spend just money on job boards through that? That cost number has to have context to it.
And I think that's a great closing because I'm looking at the time, and we're at time, unfortunately. But data is amazing, but you absolutely have to overlay it with real life. So with that, I will send you back to real life. And thank you for attending our panel. I think we'd all love to talk more about it. So thank you.